What happens when the most powerful man alive retreats to a sun-drenched island and turns it into a precision machine for pleasure and control? Picture silk curtains, hidden corridors, a silver tray shaking in your hands as doors open to rituals Rome wouldn't dare name. This isn't rumor, it's Capri, 29 AD. Step inside Villa Jovis, where pleasure was policy and a whisper could change an empire. Before diving into these forgotten stories of power and depravity, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What we call private life today, the intimate moments between consenting adults, the personal choices about pleasure and companionship, existed within frameworks so radically different in ancient Rome that they challenge every assumption we hold about power, consent, and human dignity. These weren't aberrations or exceptions to imperial rule. They were woven into the very fabric of absolute authority, supported by law, custom, and the terrifying reality that when you command the known world, no desire is too extreme to fulfill. Tiberius Claudius Nero, born in 42 BC to one of Rome's most distinguished patrician families, seemed destined for greatness from birth. His stepfather Augustus molded him into the perfect heir, a military commander who conquered Germania and secured Rome's northern frontiers, administrator who managed the empire's complex bureaucracies with methodical precision. Yet beneath this facade of imperial dignity lurked appetites that would transform a remote Mediterranean island into a playground for the darkest impulses of absolute power. Capri, a limestone jewel rising from azure waters 20 miles south of Naples, had attracted wealthy Romans for generations. Its dramatic cliffs, hidden coves, and isolation from the mainland made it perfect for those seeking privacy from the prying eyes of the capital. But when Tiberius arrived in 27 AD, ostensibly for his health, he brought with him resources and authority that would transform this peaceful retreat into something unprecedented in Roman history. The villa complex Tiberius constructed defied every convention of Roman architecture and social organization. 12 separate palaces sprawled across the island's most scenic locations, each designed for specific forms of entertainment that pushed the boundaries of Roman moral codes to their breaking point. The Villa Jovis, perched on Capri's highest peak, served as his primary residence and the nerve center of imperial government. From its terraces, Tiberius could see across the Bay of Naples to the Vesuvian coast while conducting the business of empire through a network of messengers who arrived daily with reports from every corner of the Roman world. But the Villa Jovis was more than an administrative center. Its private chambers, bathhouses, and gardens were designed with a level of luxury that exceeded even the golden palace Nero would later construct in Rome. Archaeologists excavating the site have uncovered frescoes depicting sexual acts with the explicitness that shocked Victorian scholars, who either destroyed them or locked them away in private collections. The villa's layout reveals spaces clearly intended for activities that required absolute secrecy. Chambers accessible only through hidden passages, rooms with no windows that face the mainland, underground corridors that connected buildings without exposing their users to observation. Suetonius, writing nearly a century later, described Tiberius's transformation on Capri in language so shocking that medieval monks copying his manuscripts often omitted entire passages. He wrote of imperial chambers where young men and women, selected for their beauty from across the empire, were trained in practices that combined Greek philosophical traditions with Oriental techniques learned from captured prisoners and foreign ambassadors. These weren't casual encounters or simple debauchery. They were elaborate rituals that reflected Tiberius's belief that absolute power should extend to absolute control over human bodies and souls. The emperor's daily routine on Capri followed patterns that would have scandalized even the most dissolute aristocrats in Rome. He rose before dawn to conduct imperial business, dictating correspondence to secretaries, reviewing reports from provincial governors, and making decisions that affected millions of lives. But as the Mediterranean sun climbed higher, Tiberius would retreat to the villa's private sections, where activities began that transformed the ruler of the civilized world into something that contemporary Romans could barely comprehend. Tacitus, the most reliable of Roman historians, wrote with characteristic understatement about Tiberius's years on Capri, noting that the emperor's isolation allowed him to indulge vices that distance concealed. But even Tacitus, writing for an audience familiar with imperial excesses, found it necessary to veil his descriptions in euphemisms and classical allusions. The full extent of what occurred in those marble chambers remained hidden behind the curtain of imperial privacy, protected by the absolute loyalty of servants who understood that discretion meant survival. The island's transformation under Tiberius involved more than architectural modifications. The emperor imported specialists from across the Mediterranean world, individuals whose skills extended far beyond conventional entertainment. From Alexandria came physicians who specialized in enhancing physical pleasure through chemical and surgical means. From Babylon arrived practitioners of erotic arts that combined sensual techniques with psychological manipulation. From the Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine came captured warriors whose physical attributes had caught the emperor's attention during his military campaigns. These imported experts established what amounted to schools of pleasure within the villa complex, institutions dedicated to training young Romans in practices that would have been impossible to pursue openly in the capital. The curriculum extended beyond mere physical techniques to include psychological methods for breaking down resistance, chemical preparations that enhanced sensation or induced compliance, and elaborate theatrical presentations that transformed sexual encounters into complex performances with multiple participants playing carefully scripted roles. The servants who maintained these establishments operated within a hierarchy as complex as any governmental bureaucracy. At the top were trusted freedmen who had proven their absolute loyalty through years of service and their willingness to participate in activities that bound them to the emperor through shared guilt. Below them worked slaves whose beauty, intelligence, or special skills had earned them privileged positions within the imperial household. At the bottom were recent acquisitions, young men and women purchased from slave markets across the empire or captured during military campaigns, individuals whose training for their new roles had just begun. This human machinery of pleasure operated with the efficiency that characterized all aspects of Roman administration. Records were kept of preferences and performances, schedules maintained that ensured variety without repetition, and careful attention paid to the health and appearance of those whose services the emperor required. The villa's medical facilities rivaled those of major cities, staffed by Greek physicians who specialized in treating conditions and injuries that resulted from the establishment's unique activities. The psychological atmosphere within this isolated paradise was unlike anything that had existed before in Roman history. Tiberius possessed not just the wealth of an empire, but the legal authority to compel any form of behavior from those under his control. Slaves had no rights that their master was bound to respect, but even free Romans who visited Capri understood that refusing the emperor's invitations carried consequences that extended far beyond social embarrassment. The island existed outside normal Roman law, a realm where imperial will was the only constraint on human action. Yet, even in this environment of absolute power, human nature asserted itself in unexpected ways. Some of those brought to Capri for the emperor's pleasure discovered that their unique positions granted them influence over the man who ruled the world. A beautiful youth whose company Tiberius particularly enjoyed might find himself consulted on matters of state policy. A clever woman who understood the emperor's psychological needs could accumulate wealth and influence that exceeded that of senators' wives. The most successful inhabitants of this strange world learned to navigate between submission and manipulation, offering their bodies while protecting their minds and gradually accumulating the resources necessary for survival in a realm where imperial favor was the only security. The island's isolation also created opportunities for forms of entertainment that would have been impossible in Rome's crowded urban environment. Tiberius constructed amphitheaters and performance spaces where elaborate spectacles combined elements of traditional Roman games with activities that pushed far beyond accepted boundaries. These weren't simply gladiatorial contests or theatrical performances, but complex presentations that involved dozens of participants in scenarios that blurred the lines between drama, religious ritual, and organized sexual activity. The emperor's guests at these presentations included some of the most powerful figures in the Roman world, individuals whose presence on Capri bound them to Tiberius through shared participation in activities that could never be acknowledged publicly. Provincial governors, military commanders, and wealthy merchants who sought imperial favor found themselves drawn into a web of complicity that ensured their loyalty through mutual vulnerability. What happened on Capri stayed on Capri, not through choice, but through the understanding that exposure would mean destruction for everyone involved. The financial resources required to maintain this elaborate establishment strained even the imperial treasury. Ships arrived regularly from the mainland, carrying luxury goods from every corner of the known world. Exotic foods that were consumed at banquets where the entertainment exceeded the cost of the meal, and specialized equipment crafted by artisans who were sworn to secrecy about their commissions. The emperor's agents scoured slave markets from Britain to Nubia, seeking individuals whose physical attributes or special talents justified the enormous prices Tiberius was willing to pay. Yet money was only one component of the system that sustained Tiberius's island paradise. The emperor's political authority allowed him to command services and resources that no amount of gold could purchase in the open market. Provincial governors competed to send their finest offerings to Capri, understanding that the emperor's pleasure could determine their careers and the fate of their families. Military commanders forwarded prisoners whose capture had been motivated as much by their potential entertainment value as by strategic considerations. Even senators and patrician families found ways to demonstrate their loyalty by contributing to the emperor's collections of human beauty and talent. The sophisticated network that enabled Tiberius's activities extended far beyond the shores of Capri itself. In Rome, a carefully selected group of agents worked to identify and acquire individuals who might serve the emperor's increasingly specific requirements. These procurement specialists operated with unlimited imperial authority, empowered to override local laws and customs when they encountered resistance to their collections. A beautiful patrician daughter whose father had fallen into debt might find herself invited to visit the emperor's island retreat, never to return to her family's household. A promising young athlete whose performances had caught official attention could be conscripted for imperial service under the pretense of joining the Praetorian Guard. The selection process had evolved into a science that combined aesthetic evaluation with psychological assessment. Tiberius's preferences had grown more refined and particular during his years of isolation, leading to the development of elaborate criteria that his agents used when evaluating potential acquisitions. Physical beauty was merely the foundation upon which other qualities were measured. Intelligence mattered, but not the kind that might lead to rebellion or escape attempts. Emotional sensitivity was prized, but only when combined with the psychological flexibility necessary to adapt to circumstances that defied normal human experience. Training programs within the villa complex had evolved to address the emperor's increasingly sophisticated demands. New arrivals underwent months of preparation designed to reshape not just their bodies, but their fundamental understanding of their place in the world. Greek tutors taught them to speak with the refined accents that pleased the emperor's ear, while movement instructors trained them in the graceful gestures that enhanced their visual appeal. But the most crucial education involved learning to anticipate and respond to desires that were never explicitly stated, developing an intuitive understanding of what would provide satisfaction in encounters where traditional social rules no longer applied. The psychological techniques employed in this training drew from philosophical traditions that stretched back to the mystery cults of the ancient world. Practitioners who had studied in Alexandria and Athens brought knowledge of methods that could alter consciousness and reshape identity through carefully controlled experiences of pleasure and pain. These weren't crude tortures or simple conditioning, but sophisticated processes that worked to dissolve the psychological barriers that normally protected individual autonomy. The goal was not to break the spirit, but to redirect it, creating individuals whose greatest pleasure came from providing satisfaction to others. Daily life within the villa complex followed rhythms that bore little resemblance to normal Roman social patterns. The emperor's schedule determined everything, from the timing of meals to the selection of entertainment for each evening's activities. But Tiberius's preferences were unpredictable, shaped by political pressures from the mainland, seasonal changes that affected his moods, and the constant arrival of new individuals whose novelty temporarily captured his attention. Those who served him learned to read subtle signs that indicated which direction the imperial appetite might turn, preparing themselves for roles that could range from intimate companion to elaborate theatrical performer. The island's physical environment had been modified to support activities that required specific settings and equipment. Hidden beaches accessible only through secret passages provided venues for encounters that combined the beauty of natural surroundings with complete privacy from observation. Underground chambers carved into the limestone cliffs offered spaces where sounds would not carry, and where activities could continue regardless of weather conditions above ground. Gardens designed by the finest landscape architects in the empire created outdoor settings that enhanced the visual appeal of whatever performances they were designed to frame. Seasonal festivals on Capri bore little resemblance to traditional Roman celebrations. The emperor created his own calendar of observances that drew inspiration from religious traditions across the Mediterranean world, while serving primarily as occasions for increasingly elaborate forms of entertainment. The spring celebration of Venus involved rituals that combined elements of fertility worship with activities that would have shocked the priests who maintained the goddess's temples in Rome. Summer solstice gatherings included performances that lasted for days, with participants rotating through different roles as their endurance permitted. The Autumn Harvest Festival had been transformed into a celebration of abundance that extended far beyond agricultural prosperity. Tiberius imported delicacies from every corner of the empire, creating banquets where exotic foods served as pretexts for equally exotic entertainment. Guests reclined on couches arranged around performance spaces, where the evening's activities unfolded according to scripts that had been rehearsed for weeks in advance. The boundary between audience and performer dissolved as wine and other substances lowered inhibitions and encouraged participation in activities that grew progressively more elaborate as the night progressed. Winter celebrations took advantage of the island's isolation when storms made travel to the mainland dangerous for weeks at a time. These extended periods of enforced seclusion became opportunities for the most intensive and prolonged activities of the year. The villa's heating systems, more advanced than those found anywhere else in the empire, maintained comfortable temperatures in chambers where clothing was optional and privacy absolute. Participants in these winter festivals often emerged weeks later, fundamentally changed by experiences that had pushed them beyond the boundaries of their previous understanding of human possibility. The emperor's personal quarters within the Villa Jovis reflected his evolution from Roman aristocrat to something that defied traditional categories. The bedroom where he slept was appointed with luxuries that exceeded even royal standards, but it was the adjacent chambers that revealed the true nature of his transformation. These private spaces contained collections that represented decades of acquisition from across the known world. Artworks depicting acts that no public museum would display, mechanical devices whose purposes were immediately obvious to anyone who examined them, and libraries containing texts that explored the theoretical foundations underlying the practices that had become central to his existence. Tiberius's correspondence from this period, fragments of which survived in private collections, reveals a mind that had moved far beyond conventional Roman moral categories. Letters to trusted agents in Rome discussed human acquisitions with the same clinical detachment that other emperors might use when purchasing horses or hunting dogs. Instructions for training programs were detailed with the precision of military manuals, outlining psychological techniques and physical preparations with scientific thoroughness that suggested years of experimentation and refinement. The emperor's relationship with his closest associates on Capri had evolved into something that combined elements of friendship, conspiracy, and mutual dependence. These individuals, primarily freedmen whose loyalty had been tested through years of shared activities, served as advisors, procurers, and participants in the island's most sensitive activities. Their influence over imperial policy often exceeded that of senators and consuls in Rome, creating a shadow government that operated according to principles that had nothing to do with traditional Roman political values. Communication between Capri and the mainland required careful management to prevent information about the island's true activities from reaching inappropriate audiences. Official correspondence dealt with matters of state and language that revealed nothing about the sender's personal circumstances. But coded messages conveyed information about acquisitions, preparations, and scheduling that enabled the smooth operation of systems that stretched across the empire. A seemingly innocent reference to theatrical preparations might actually describe arrangements for activities that would have resulted in exile or execution if conducted openly in Rome. The economic impact of Tiberius's activities extended far beyond the direct costs of maintaining his establishment. Industries developed to serve imperial preferences that would never acknowledge their true customers. Craftsmen specialized in creating objects whose purposes were never explicitly stated, but whose functions were understood by those who commissioned them. Merchants established trade routes that brought exotic substances and rare individuals to Mediterranean ports, where imperial agents waited to transport them to their final destination. The psychological toll on those who served the emperor's pleasure varied dramatically depending on their individual resilience and the specific roles they were required to play. Some adapted completely to their circumstances, finding genuine satisfaction in lives that provided luxury and security in exchange for forms of service that became routine through repetition. Others maintained internal resistance while performing their duties with apparent enthusiasm, protecting their essential selves through mental strategies that allowed them to dissociate from their physical experiences. The most successful inhabitants of this strange world were those who discovered ways to turn their positions to personal advantage, while maintaining the appearance of complete submission to imperial will. A few individuals accumulated enough wealth and influence to eventually purchase their freedom and establish independent lives away from the island. Others used their access to the emperor to advance family members or friends, creating networks of obligation that provided security for their futures. But for most, survival required accepting that their previous identities had been permanently erased, replaced by new selves whose primary purpose was providing satisfaction to the man who ruled the world. As Tiberius aged and his appetites grew more refined and demanding, the activities on Capri evolved in directions that pushed even further beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. What had begun as elaborate entertainment became something approaching religious ritual, with the emperor serving as both priest and deity in ceremonies that combined elements from mystery cults across the Mediterranean world. These weren't casual indulgences, but carefully structured experiences designed to transcend the limitations of ordinary pleasure and achieve states of consciousness that the emperor believed were appropriate to his divine status. The island itself had become a laboratory for exploring the outer limits of human desire and endurance, a place where the normal constraints of law, custom, and conscience had been suspended to allow pure imperial will to express itself without limitation. The servants who witnessed these transformations understood that they were observing something unprecedented in human history. Not simply the corruption of power, which Romans had seen before in figures like Caligula or Nero, but the methodical construction of an alternative reality where every aspect of existence had been reshaped to serve desires that grew more complex with each passing season. The morning rituals that began each day in the Villa Jovis followed patterns that would have been incomprehensible to visitors from the mainland. Tiberius rose before dawn, but not to the sound of cockcrows or temple bells. Instead, carefully trained musicians provided awakening melodies composed specifically to ease the transition from sleep to consciousness, without jarring the imperial nervous system. The emperor's first conscious moments were orchestrated with the precision of a theatrical performance, designed to establish the psychological framework that would govern the entire day's activities. His personal attendants, selected through years of observation and training, understood that their master's moods in these crucial first hours would determine the nature of everything that followed. A servant who moved too quickly or spoke too loudly might trigger imperial displeasure that would cascade through the villa's entire hierarchy. Conversely, those who perfectly anticipated the emperor's needs during these delicate moments often found themselves elevated to positions of unprecedented influence within the island's complex social structure. The bathing rituals that followed Tiberius's awakening had evolved far beyond the elaborate cleansing ceremonies practiced by wealthy Romans throughout the empire. The villa's bath complex fed by springs that had been diverted and heated through engineering marvels that exceeded even Roman standards, provided settings for activities that combined hygiene with forms of stimulation that prepared the emperor's body and mind for the day's more intensive pleasures. Greek physicians, whose knowledge of human anatomy surpassed that of their colleagues in Rome, had developed treatments that enhanced physical sensation while maintaining the health necessary for sustained activity. These medical procedures, performed in chambers decorated with frescoes depicting healing gods engaged in acts that no temple would acknowledge, represented the marriage of scientific knowledge with imperial appetite that characterized everything about Tiberius's island paradise. The oils and unguents applied during these sessions were compounded from ingredients gathered across 3 continents. Merchants in distant Alexandria, Damascus, and even India received orders that arrived with imperial seals, demanding substances whose properties were known only to specialists who had dedicated their lives to understanding the enhancement of human pleasure. The formulations changed seasonally, adjusted according to astrological calculations and the emperor's evolving preferences, creating a pharmaceutical regimen that supported activities of increasing intensity and duration. Educational programs within the villa complex had expanded beyond the training of new acquisitions to include advanced instruction for those who had proven their value through months or years of service. These weren't simply lessons in technique or deportment, but sophisticated courses of study that drew from philosophical traditions stretching back to ancient Babylon and Egypt. Students learned to read the subtle physical and psychological signs that indicated another person's deepest desires, developing skills that allowed them to provide satisfaction that their subjects didn't even realize they craved. The theoretical foundations underlying these educational programs reflected Tiberius's belief that true mastery over others required understanding not just their bodies but their souls. Texts imported from the Library of Alexandria explored the connections between physical sensation and spiritual transcendence, while Persian manuscripts detailed psychological techniques for reshaping personality through carefully controlled experiences of pleasure and submission. The emperor himself had become a scholar of human nature, studying his subjects with the same intensity that other rulers devoted to military strategy or economic policy. Architectural modifications to the villa complex continued throughout Tiberius's residence on Capri, with new chambers and passages added to accommodate activities that required increasingly specific environmental conditions. Underground workshops produced equipment and furniture designed for purposes that no craftsman on the mainland would acknowledge. The island's limestone cliffs were honeycombed with hidden chambers accessible only through passages known to the emperor's most trusted associates, creating a 3-dimensional maze where privacy was absolute and normal social rules ceased to exist. The villa's gardens had been transformed into outdoor theaters where natural beauty provided backdrops for performances that incorporated landscape features as integral elements of the entertainment. Grottos carved into cliffsides became intimate venues for encounters that combined the drama of natural settings with complete control over environmental factors. Terraces overlooking the sea provided stages where participants could perform against the backdrop of infinite blue horizons, creating visual experiences that enhanced the psychological impact of whatever activities were unfolding in the foreground. Seasonal changes in the Mediterranean climate were incorporated into the villa's activity calendar with the precision of agricultural planning. Spring brought opportunities for outdoor celebrations that took advantage of mild temperatures and blooming vegetation, with participants adorned in flower garlands that gradually gave way to more revealing costumes as evening progressed into night. Summer's heat created excuses for minimal clothing and frequent cooling treatments that provided natural transitions into more intimate activities. The autumn harvest season had been reimagined as a celebration of human rather than agricultural abundance, with festivals that lasted for weeks and involved participants from across the empire. These gatherings required months of preparation, with advanced teams scouring slave markets and provincial capitals to identify individuals whose particular attributes would contribute to the seasonal celebrations. The logistics of transporting, housing, and preparing hundreds of participants for these elaborate events rivaled military campaigns in their complexity and scope. Winter storms, which isolated Capri from the mainland for weeks at a time, created opportunities for the year's most intensive activities. The villa's heating systems maintained tropical temperatures in chambers where participants could remain comfortable regardless of the weather outside. These extended periods of enforced seclusion became laboratories for experiments that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and adaptability, with the emperor serving as both scientist and primary subject in investigations that explored the furthest reaches of physical and psychological possibility. The psychological atmosphere during these winter retreats developed its own unique characteristics, shaped by the combination of physical isolation, environmental control, and the presence of individuals who had been selected specifically for their ability to transcend normal limitations. Participants often reported experiencing altered states of consciousness that persisted for weeks after the activities concluded, suggesting that the emperor's experiments were achieving their intended effects of fundamentally reshaping human awareness and capability. Religious elements had crept into the villa's activities, as Tiberius began to view his experiments not as mere indulgence, but as sacred exploration of divine prerogatives. Altars dedicated to gods whose worship was forbidden in Rome appeared in private chambers, while rituals borrowed from mystery cults across the Mediterranean provided frameworks for activities that transcended simple physical pleasure. The emperor increasingly saw himself not just as a ruler, but as a high priest in service to deities who demanded forms of worship that conventional Roman religion could never accommodate. The financial networks supporting these activities had evolved into economic systems that operated parallel to normal imperial commerce. Whole industries existed to serve preferences that could never be acknowledged publicly, with craftsmen, merchants, and service providers bound together through shared knowledge that ensured absolute discretion. Money flowed through channels that bypassed normal accounting procedures, creating shadow economies that supported everything from specialized manufacturing to international human trafficking. Provincial administrators throughout the empire understood that career advancement required contributing to imperial collections that were never officially requested, but always gratefully received. A governor who identified particularly attractive candidates for imperial service might find his term extended or his province expanded. Military commanders who forwarded prisoners with special qualities discovered that their campaigns received additional funding and support. Even tax collectors learned to identify citizens whose financial difficulties might make them receptive to offers of alternative forms of service to the state. The recruitment networks had become so sophisticated that they operated like intelligence services, with agents in major cities throughout the empire maintaining detailed records of individuals who might eventually serve imperial purposes. These databases included physical descriptions, family circumstances, psychological profiles, and assessments of special talents or abilities that might prove valuable in the villa's unique environment. When the emperor expressed interest in particular types of companions, his agents could quickly identify and acquire suitable candidates from locations thousands of miles away. Training protocols had evolved to address the specific challenges of preparing individuals for service in environments that defied normal human experience. New arrivals underwent psychological evaluation designed to identify their particular strengths and vulnerabilities, allowing instructors to customize preparation programs that maximized each person's potential contribution to the island's activities. The most promising candidates received advanced education that could last for months, transforming them from whatever they had been previously into specialists whose skills were perfectly adapted to their new roles. The villa's medical facilities had expanded to include experimental treatment centers, where Greek and Egyptian physicians explored the boundaries of human physical and psychological adaptation. These weren't crude torture chambers, but sophisticated laboratories where the empire's finest minds investigated questions about human nature that could never be studied in conventional settings. Subjects volunteered for procedures that promised enhanced sensation, increased endurance, or altered consciousness in exchange for improved status within the island's hierarchy. Chemical preparations developed in these medical centers drew from pharmaceutical knowledge gathered across 3 continents, combining traditional remedies with innovative compounds that produced effects unavailable through conventional means. Substances that enhanced pleasure, reduced inhibitions, or altered perception were refined through careful experimentation, creating a pharmacological arsenal that supported activities of unprecedented intensity and duration. The emperor's personal transformation during his years on Capri reflected not just the corruption of absolute power, but the systematic exploration of human potential, freed from normal social constraints. Tiberius had become something beyond a Roman ruler, evolving into a figure who embodied possibilities that conventional civilization could neither acknowledge nor accommodate. His daily existence incorporated elements of philosopher, priest, scientist, and artist, unified through a vision of human potential that transcended traditional moral categories. His closest associates had undergone similar transformations, developing into individuals whose skills and knowledge could never be employed in normal Roman society. These trusted companions served as both collaborators and subjects in experiments that pushed the boundaries of human experience, creating an inner circle whose loyalty was ensured not just through shared complicity, but through genuine commitment to explorations that had become the central purpose of their existence. The island itself had been transformed into something that existed outside normal geography, a place where the physical laws of the Roman world gave way to possibilities that imperial will had made real. Capri had become a laboratory, a temple, a school, and a playground, simultaneously unified through the vision of a man who possessed both the resources and the authority to transform his most extreme desires into lived reality. As Tiberius entered his final years of life, the activities on Capri reached levels of complexity and intensity that defied description in conventional language. What had begun as elaborate entertainment had evolved into something approaching a new form of human existence, with participants who had been so thoroughly transformed by their experiences that return to normal life had become impossible. The emperor had succeeded in creating not just a pleasure palace, but an alternative civilization where different rules governed human relationships and different possibilities, defined the limits of individual experience. The morning light filtering through the villa's silk curtains illuminated scenes that would remain hidden from history for centuries, protected by the absolute silence of those who understood that their survival depended on maintaining secrets that could never be safely revealed. In those marble chambers overlooking the azure Mediterranean, the ruler of the civilized world continued his exploration of territories that no map could chart and no conventional morality could comprehend. The servants who moved through these transformed spaces had developed their own complex social hierarchies, entirely separate from the rigid class structures that governed Roman society on the mainland. Within the villa's walls, traditional distinctions between slave and free, patrician and plebeian, citizen and foreigner, had dissolved into categories that existed nowhere else in the empire. A beautiful Germanic captive might wield more influence over imperial policy than senators who traced their lineages back to the founding of Rome. A Greek philosopher, nominally free, might find himself entirely subject to the whims of a teenage Egyptian dancer, whose particular talents had caught the emperor's attention. These inverted power structures created psychological tensions that the villa's inhabitants navigated with skills that would have impressed the most accomplished diplomats in the capital. Survival required not just physical compliance, but emotional intelligence of the highest order. Individuals learned to read microscopic changes in facial expression, to interpret the significance of seemingly casual gestures, to anticipate desires that the emperor himself might not yet fully understand. The most successful developed an almost supernatural ability to sense shifts in imperial mood, positioning themselves advantageously before others even recognized that the emotional weather was changing. The villa's daily rhythms followed patterns that bore no resemblance to normal Roman domestic life. Mealtimes were determined not by solar position but by the emperor's activity schedule, which could extend certain encounters for hours beyond their planned duration, or compress elaborate preparations into moments when imperial attention suddenly shifted to unexpected pursuits. The kitchens operated continuously, prepared to serve delicacies from any corner of the empire at whatever hour Tiberius might decide to combine culinary pleasure with other forms of entertainment. Food itself had become another medium for artistic expression, with skilled cooks from Alexandria and Antioch creating dishes whose visual presentation enhanced the aesthetic experience of whatever activities they were designed to accompany. Exotic spices were employed not just for flavor but for their alleged effects on human physiology, with certain combinations believed to enhance stamina, increase sensitivity, or induce psychological states that facilitated participation in the evening's planned activities. The emperor's table had become a pharmacological laboratory where cuisine and chemistry merged in service of desires that grew more sophisticated with each passing season. The island's communication networks had evolved to handle information that could never be transmitted through normal imperial channels. Coded languages developed naturally among the villa's inhabitants, allowing them to discuss activities and arrangements without risking exposure if their conversations were overheard by individuals who lacked appropriate clearance. Written records were kept in ciphers that drew from Greek mathematical principles and Persian astronomical texts, creating documentation systems that protected sensitive information while maintaining the detailed accounts that efficient administration required. Musical performances within the villa complex had expanded far beyond traditional Roman entertainment to incorporate elements from cultures across the known world. Skilled musicians from Nubia, Gaul, and distant Scythia brought instruments and vocal techniques that created soundscapes designed to enhance whatever visual spectacles were unfolding simultaneously. These weren't background accompaniments, but integral components of experiences that engaged every human sense, creating immersive environments where participants could lose themselves completely in activities that transported them beyond ordinary consciousness. The emperor's personal collection of artworks had grown to include pieces that no public museum would display and no private collector would acknowledge owning. These objects, created by artists whose names were never recorded and whose existence was carefully concealed, depicted scenes and activities that pushed the boundaries of what visual art could represent. Some were realistic portrayals of the villa's actual activities, while others were fantastical imaginings of possibilities that even Tiberius hadn't yet explored. Together, they created a visual catalog of human potential that existed nowhere else in the ancient world. Technological innovations developed specifically for the villa's unique requirements had advanced beyond anything available in Rome or other major cities. Engineering solutions addressed challenges that conventional architecture never faced, creating spaces that could be rapidly reconfigured for different types of activities, environmental systems that maintained perfect conditions regardless of external weather, and mechanical devices that enhanced human capability in ways that their inventors could never publicly acknowledge. The island had become a laboratory for applied sciences that existed centuries ahead of their time. The seasonal festivals that punctuated the villa's calendar had evolved into celebrations that incorporated elements from religious traditions spanning 3 continents. Spring equinox ceremonies drew from Celtic fertility rites, Egyptian resurrection myths, and Persian solar worship, creating syncretic observances that provided spiritual frameworks for activities that transcended mere physical pleasure. These weren't casual borrowings, but sophisticated theological syntheses that reflected the emperor's belief that his explorations deserved divine sanction from whatever gods might approve of such endeavors. Training programs for new arrivals had developed into educational systems that rivaled the philosophical schools of Athens and Alexandria in their intellectual sophistication. Students learned not just practical techniques, but theoretical frameworks that placed their service within larger contexts of human potential and divine purpose. The most advanced curriculum included studies in psychology, anatomy, chemistry, and even astronomy, creating individuals whose knowledge and capabilities extended far beyond what their roles might initially suggest. The villa's library had grown to include texts that existed nowhere else in the world, manuscripts that documented practices and philosophies that conventional scholars would never acknowledge studying. These collections drew from esoteric traditions that stretched back to Babylon and beyond, incorporating knowledge that had been carefully preserved by mystery cults and secret societies throughout the Mediterranean world. Tiberius had become not just a practitioner, but a serious scholar of human sexuality, studying his subject with the same intellectual rigor that other emperors devoted to military strategy or economic policy. Medical research conducted within the villa's sophisticated facilities had advanced understanding of human physiology in ways that wouldn't be equaled for centuries. Physicians working under imperial patronage explored questions about sensation, consciousness, and physical capability that conventional medicine could never investigate. Their discoveries, carefully documented in coded texts, revealed possibilities for human experience that challenged fundamental assumptions about the limitations of mortal existence. Some of their innovations were so far ahead of contemporary medical knowledge that their principles wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance. The psychological techniques developed through years of experimentation had created methodologies for human transformation that combined elements of Greek philosophy, Oriental mysticism, and empirical observation. These weren't crude manipulations, but sophisticated processes that worked with natural psychological mechanisms to produce desired changes in personality, capability, and desire. The most successful applications created individuals who genuinely preferred their transformed states to their original conditions, eliminating the resistance and resentment that plagued less sophisticated approaches to human modification. International networks supporting the villa's activities had expanded to include agents in kingdoms and territories that maintained no official diplomatic relations with Rome. The emperor's representatives operated in India, China, and even mysterious lands beyond the known world, seeking individuals and substances that might contribute to activities that had become increasingly global in their scope. These procurement operations required diplomatic skills that exceeded those of conventional ambassadors, as they often involved negotiations for commodities that no legitimate government would acknowledge trading. The villa's influence on imperial policy had become so pervasive that decisions affecting millions of Roman citizens were often made based on considerations that would have horrified senators and consuls if they had understood the true factors shaping their emperor's choices. Military campaigns were planned partly to secure access to regions that might yield suitable candidates for imperial collection. Trade agreements included secret provisions that facilitated the movement of individuals and substances that served the villa's specialized requirements. Even religious policies were influenced by the emperor's desire to incorporate elements from various traditions into his personal spiritual practices. Financial flows supporting these activities had created economic distortions that affected markets throughout the Mediterranean world. Certain luxury goods commanded prices that reflected not their intrinsic value but their utility in imperial activities that could never be publicly acknowledged. Skilled craftsmen found themselves producing objects whose purposes they could only guess at, while merchants developed trade routes that served customers whose identities they were forbidden to investigate. The villa had become the center of shadow economies that operated parallel to legitimate commerce throughout the empire. The emperor's personal evolution during his final years on Capri reflected not just individual transformation, but the emergence of entirely new categories of human experience. Tiberius had transcended the limitations that normally constrained mortal rulers, developing capabilities and engaging in activities that placed him beyond conventional moral judgment. He had become something unprecedented in human history, an individual with both the resources and the authority to transform his most extreme visions into lived reality, unlimited by law, custom, or conscience. His closest associates had undergone parallel transformations, evolving into beings whose knowledge and experience could never be communicated to individuals who hadn't shared similar journeys. These companions served not just as participants, but as collaborators in explorations that had pushed beyond the boundaries of what previous generations had considered humanly possible. Together, they had created a community that existed outside normal social categories, bound together by shared experiences that no conventional language could adequately describe. The island itself had been transformed into something that existed beyond normal geography, a place where the physical laws governing the rest of the Roman world gave way to possibilities that imperial will had made manifest. Capri had become simultaneously laboratory, temple, school, and theater, unified through the vision of a ruler who possessed both the imagination to conceive unprecedented possibilities and the power to transform those visions into concrete reality. As the Mediterranean sun climbed toward its zenith on another perfect day in this isolated paradise, the activities within the villa complex continued to unfold, according to patterns that had evolved far beyond anything that conventional Roman society could acknowledge or understand. In chambers decorated with artworks that no museum would display, using techniques that no scholar would study, the ruler of the civilized world continued his exploration of territories that existed beyond the reach of normal human experience. The servants carrying their silver trays moved through corridors where the whispered conversations had long since evolved beyond the capacity of ordinary language to convey their true meaning. In this realm, where absolute power had created absolute possibility, the boundaries between ruler and subject, pleasure and transcendence, human and divine had dissolved into something entirely new under the endless blue of the Mediterranean sky. The transformation of Tiberius during his final years on Capri represented something that historians have struggled to classify or comprehend. Contemporary accounts, filtered through layers of imperial censorship and moral outrage, provide only glimpses of activities that pushed beyond every boundary that Roman civilization had established. What emerged from those marble chambers wasn't simply corruption or decadence, but the systematic construction of an entirely new form of human existence, one that operated according to principles that conventional morality could neither accommodate nor explain. The emperor's daily routine had evolved into ritualistic sequences that bore no resemblance to normal imperial administration. Each morning began with preparatory ceremonies that combined elements of religious observance with activities designed to achieve psychological states that conventional Romans would have considered supernatural. These weren't casual indulgences, but carefully structured experiences that required hours of preparation and could extend well into the following day, depending on their success in achieving the transcendent states that had become the true purpose of imperial existence. The villa's most secret chambers contained equipment and furnishings that represented technological innovations centuries ahead of their time. Craftsmen working under absolute secrecy had developed mechanical devices that enhanced human capability in ways that their creators could never publicly acknowledge. These weren't crude instruments of torture or simple pleasure devices, but sophisticated machines that reflected deep understanding of human anatomy and psychology. The engineering principles underlying their construction incorporated knowledge that wouldn't be formally recognized by medical science for more than a millennium. Chemical preparations used during the villa's activities had evolved far beyond the crude potions employed by conventional pleasure seekers throughout the empire. The emperor's personal alchemists, working with ingredients gathered from the furthest reaches of the known world, had developed substances that could alter consciousness, enhance physical sensation, and even modify personality traits through carefully controlled administration. These formulations represented the marriage of empirical observation with theoretical knowledge drawn from the most advanced philosophical traditions of the ancient world. The psychological techniques employed in the villa's educational programs had achieved results that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and potential. Students who underwent the complete curriculum emerged as individuals whose capabilities extended far beyond what their original personalities had suggested possible. These transformations weren't achieved through crude coercion, but through sophisticated methodologies that worked with natural psychological mechanisms to produce desired changes in thought, emotion, and behavior. The most successful graduates genuinely preferred their modified states to their original conditions, having discovered aspects of human experience that conventional society could never acknowledge. International recruitment networks had expanded to include operations in territories that existed beyond the official borders of Roman knowledge. The emperor's agents worked in kingdoms whose names appeared on no Roman maps, seeking individuals whose unique attributes justified the enormous risks and expenses involved in their acquisition. These procurement missions often resembled military expeditions in their complexity and duration, requiring months of travel through dangerous territories to reach populations that might yield suitable candidates for imperial service. The so pervasive that major villas' influence on imperial policy had become decisions affecting the entire Roman world were often made based on considerations that bore no relationship to conventional statecraft. Military campaigns were planned partly to provide access to regions whose populations might include individuals with attributes that serve the emperor's increasingly specific requirements. Diplomatic relations with foreign kingdoms were evaluated not just for their strategic value, but for their potential to facilitate activities that no official treaty could acknowledge. Even religious policies reflected the emperor's desire to incorporate elements from various traditions into personal practices that existed entirely outside Orthodox Roman spirituality. Training facilities within the villa complex had evolved into institutions that rivaled the most prestigious schools of philosophy in their intellectual sophistication, and exceeded them in their practical application of theoretical knowledge. Advanced students studied subjects that combined traditional Roman education with disciplines that existed nowhere else in the ancient world. The curriculum included detailed investigation of human psychology, advanced anatomy, chemical principles, and even astronomical calculations that related celestial movements to optimal timing for various forms of human interaction. The villa's medical facilities had become research centers where the empire's finest physicians explored questions about human capability that conventional medicine could never investigate. Working under conditions of absolute secrecy, these practitioners had developed treatments and procedures that enhanced natural human abilities in ways that their subjects often described as miraculous. The techniques they pioneered incorporated knowledge from medical traditions spanning 3 continents, synthesized through empirical observation, and theoretical analysis into methodologies that wouldn't be equaled for centuries. Architectural innovations throughout the villa complex reflected engineering solutions to challenges that no conventional Roman architect had ever faced. Spaces could be rapidly reconfigured for different types of activities through mechanical systems that operated with precision timing. Environmental controls maintained perfect conditions regardless of external weather, while acoustic engineering ensured that sounds could never travel beyond their intended audiences. The entire complex functioned as a 3-dimensional machine designed to support activities that required absolute privacy and complete environmental control. The seasonal calendar that governed villa activities had evolved into a complex system that incorporated astronomical calculations, astrological interpretations, and empirical observations about optimal conditions for various forms of human experience. Each season brought opportunities for different types of activities, with elaborate festivals that could last for weeks and involved participants from across the known world. These celebrations required months of advanced preparation, with logistics that rivaled military campaigns in their complexity and attention to detail. Religious elements had become increasingly prominent in the villa's activities, as Tiberius developed theological frameworks that justified practices which conventional Roman spirituality could never accommodate. Drawing from mystery traditions that stretched back to ancient Babylon, the emperor had created syncretic belief systems that provided divine sanction for activities that transcended normal human experience. These weren't casual borrowings, but sophisticated theological constructions that reflected serious scholarly investigation of esoteric religious traditions from across the Mediterranean world. The emperor's personal transformation during his final years represented not just individual evolution, but the emergence of entirely new categories of human potential. Tiberius had developed capabilities that placed him beyond conventional moral judgment, achieving states of consciousness and engaging in activities that previous generations would have attributed to divine beings. His daily existence incorporated elements of priest, philosopher, scientist, and artist, unified through visions of human possibility that challenged every assumption about the limitations of mortal existence. Financial networks supporting these activities had created economic distortions that affected markets throughout the Roman world and beyond. Entire industries existed to serve imperial preferences that could never be publicly acknowledged, with craftsmen, merchants, and service providers bound together through shared knowledge that ensured absolute discretion. Money flowed through channels that bypassed normal imperial accounting, creating shadow economies that operated parallel to legitimate commerce while serving requirements that no conventional market could accommodate. The villa's library had grown to include manuscripts that existed nowhere else in the ancient world, texts that documented practices and philosophies that conventional scholars would never acknowledge studying. These collections represented knowledge that had been carefully preserved by secret societies and mystery cults throughout history, brought together for the first time in a single location where they could be studied and applied without fear of religious or political persecution. The emperor had become not just a practitioner but a serious scholar of human potential, approaching his subject with intellectual rigor that exceeded most professional philosophers. Communication systems within the villa had evolved to handle information that required security measures beyond anything employed in normal imperial administration. Coded languages developed naturally among inhabitants, allowing discussion of activities and arrangements without risking exposure to individuals who lacked appropriate clearance. Written records were maintained in ciphers that incorporated mathematical principles and astronomical references, creating documentation that protected sensitive information while maintaining the detailed accounts that efficient administration required. When Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, the secrets of Capri died with him. His successors ordered the villa's most compromising chambers sealed, their contents destroyed or hidden away in imperial archives that would never see daylight. The island returned to peaceful obscurity, its marble terraces and hidden grottos offering no hint of the extraordinary activities that had once transformed a Roman emperor into something beyond conventional human categories. Yet the whispers persisted across centuries, carried in fragments of testimony and coded references that historians have spent millennia trying to decode. In those sun-drenched chambers where absolute power met unlimited desire, Tiberius had pushed the boundaries of human experience so far beyond accepted limits that even today, we struggle to comprehend the full extent of what occurred when the ruler of the civilized world decided that no pleasure was too extreme, no transformation too radical, and no exploration of human potential too dangerous to pursue. The marble columns still stand on Capri, silent witnesses to activities that redefine the very meaning of imperial authority and human possibility under the endless Mediterranean sky.